Sometimes when you think your heart has nothing left to give, life sends you exactly what you need to heal. When you've lost everything that mattered and chosen solitude over the risk of caring again, the smallest act of kindness can change everything. Silas Greer had been living alone in the Montana wilderness for years, keeping to himself after losing his wife. One frozen morning, he found a starving mother dog and her 3 pups barely alive in the snow. He took them in, thinking he was just saving their lives. But over that long winter, those dogs did something unexpected. They brought warmth back to his cold cabin and joy back to his broken heart. When spring came, the dogs led him on a journey he never saw coming. But what would he discover when he followed them back toward the world he'd left behind? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air bit sharp against Silas Greer's weathered face as he stepped onto the porch of his cabin. Steam rising from the mug of black coffee cradled in his calloused hands. 3 years he'd been living up here in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. 3 years since he'd turned his back on the world below and everything it had taken from him. The silence stretched endlessly in every direction. No car engines, no voices, no reminders of the life he'd left behind. Just wind through the towering pines and the occasional crack of settling timber. He pulled his worn flannel shirt tighter against the February cold and surveyed his domain. Snow lay thick across the clearing he'd carved from the wilderness, pristine white, broken only by his own boot prints leading to the woodshed and the small stream that provided his water. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney sending a thin column of smoke into the grey sky. It served its purpose, which was to keep the world out and himself in. Silas took a long sip of coffee and felt the familiar weight on his left ring finger. Martha's wedding ring, white gold with a small diamond that caught the light even on the cloudiest days. He'd worn it for 23 years, through their courtship, their wedding, and the 17 years of marriage that followed. He'd kept wearing it the 3 years since she'd been gone, unable to bring himself to take it off. Some mornings he'd catch himself turning it with his thumb, the way he had when he was nervous or thinking hard about something. Today was one of those mornings. The ring was all he had left of her, really. He'd sold their house in Missoula, couldn't bear to stay there with all those memories pressing in on him from every corner. Martha's garden tools still in the shed, her coffee mug still in the kitchen cabinet, her pillow still carrying the faint scent of her lavender shampoo. The realtor had looked at him with those pitying eyes when he'd signed the papers, probably thinking he was making a mistake. Maybe he was, but staying had felt like drowning, so he'd taken the money from the sale. Bought this 160 acres of nothing but trees and rock and solitude, and built himself a life that couldn't hurt him anymore. No neighbors to ask how he was doing. No well-meaning friends stopping by with casseroles and condolences. No reminders that Martha was gone and wasn't coming back. The cabin was sparse but functional. One room served as kitchen, dining and sitting area, with a stone fireplace taking up most of the north wall. A small bedroom off the back held nothing but a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. No pictures on the walls, those were too painful to look at. No radio or television. He had no interest in news from the outside world. Just the essentials, a wood-burning stove for cooking, oil lamps for light, and shelves lined with canned goods and dried supplies. Silas had always been handy with tools, a skill learned from his father and honed during his years in the Army Corps of Engineers. Building the cabin had taken him 8 months, working from dawn to dusk, grateful for the physical exhaustion that helped quiet his mind at night. He'd cut every log himself, hauled every stone for the foundation, split every shake for the roof. The work had been his salvation in those first dark months, giving him something to focus on besides the emptiness that seemed to fill his chest like cold water. He'd learned to live off the land with a thoroughness that would have impressed his grandfather, who'd homesteaded these same mountains back in the 1920s. Silas could track and trap game, preserve meat for winter, identify edible plants and medicinal herbs. He maintained a small vegetable garden during the brief growing season and had built a root cellar to store potatoes, carrots and onions through the long months of snow. Once a month, he'd make the 2-hour trek down to the nearest town, a nothing place called Whitefish Creek, to buy coffee, flour, salt and other necessities he couldn't produce himself. He spoke to no one beyond what was required for commerce, and no one tried to engage him in conversation. Mountain hermits weren't uncommon in this part of Montana. Martha would have hated this life, he knew. She'd been a social creature, happiest when surrounded by friends and family, always organizing dinner parties or volunteering at the church or tending to her elaborate flower gardens. She'd loved their house in Missoula precisely because it was in the middle of everything, walking distance to shops and restaurants, close to their friends, with neighbors she could chat with over the back fence. She tolerated his occasional hunting and fishing trips, but never understood his need to get away from civilization. "You're like some old mountain man," she'd tease him, standing on tiptoes to straighten his collar before he headed out for a weekend in the wilderness. Born 100 years too late. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd become exactly what she'd said he was, a man out of time, living like it was still 1880, but without her warmth to balance his solitary nature, without her laughter to fill the silence. This was all he had left. The mountains didn't judge. They didn't pity. They didn't try to fix him or tell him it was time to move on. Winter was his favorite season up here. The snow created a barrier between his world and everything else, making the isolation complete. He could go weeks without seeing another human being, and that suited him just fine. His days followed a simple rhythm: rise at dawn, tend the fire, eat a simple breakfast, spend the morning chopping wood or checking his trap lines, return for a midday meal, spend the afternoon maintaining his equipment or reading one of the few books he'd brought with him, eat dinner by lamplight, then sit by the fire until sleep took him. He'd read the same dozen books so many times he could recite passages from memory, mostly classics that Martha had insisted belonged in any civilized home. Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, books that reminded him of her voice, reading aloud on quiet Sunday afternoons, her head resting against his shoulder as they sat on their old couch. Sometimes he'd catch himself starting to read a particularly good passage aloud, as if she might still be there to hear it. The sound of his own voice always startled him back to reality. The loneliness was worst in the evenings, when the day's work was done, and there was nothing left but the crackling of the fire and his own thoughts. He'd taken to going to bed early, partly to conserve lamp oil, and partly to escape the weight of the silence. Dreams were dangerous territory. Too often Martha appeared in them young and laughing, and he'd wake to the crushing realization that she was gone all over again. But the alternative, lying awake in the darkness, remembering, was worse. This morning felt different somehow, though he couldn't say why. The air had that particular stillness that often preceded a heavy snowfall, and the grey clouds hung low and pregnant with moisture. His weather sense, honed by years in the mountains, told him they were in for a significant storm. He'd need to bring in extra firewood and check his food stores. Winter storms up here could last for days, and being unprepared could mean the difference between life and death. He finished his coffee and was about to head back inside when something caught his eye. Dark spots in the snow near the tree line, maybe 50 yards from his cabin. Tracks of some kind, though he couldn't make out what from this distance. They seemed too large and spread out to be from deer or elk, bear maybe, though it was unusual for them to be moving around much in February. Most were deep in hibernation by now. Silas set down his mug and walked to the edge of his porch for a better look. The tracks were definitely there, a line of depressions leading from the deeper forest toward his property. As his eyes followed their path, he noticed they seemed to wander, weaving back and forth, like whatever made them had been disoriented or weak. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold air. In his 3 years up here, he'd never had any large predators come this close to his cabin. He kept a clean camp, never leaving food scraps around, and the smell of wood smoke and human habitation usually kept the wildlife at a respectful distance. He stepped off the porch and walked closer, his boots crunching in the snow. The tracks were definitely not from a bear, wrong shape entirely. They looked almost like dog tracks, but that was impossible. There were no domestic dogs this far up in the wilderness, no other cabins for miles in any direction. The nearest neighbor was old Pete Hauser, and he lived a good 10 miles down the mountain. Pete had a couple of hunting dogs, but they'd never ranged this far from home, especially not in winter. Silas knelt beside one of the clearer prints, studying its size and shape. Definitely canine, but large, maybe 70 or 80 pounds worth of animal. The tracks were accompanied by smaller ones, much smaller, barely visible in the soft snow. Puppies. His heart began to beat faster as he followed the trail with his eyes. It led directly toward a stand of thick timber about 100 yards from his cabin, disappearing into the dark shadows beneath the trees. Whatever had made these tracks was either still out there or had moved on. But given the wandering nature of the trail and the size of those puppy tracks, Silas doubted they'd gotten very far. He stood slowly, his knees protesting the cold, and looked back toward his cabin. The smart thing would be to go inside, load his rifle, and wait to see if whatever it was moved along. Mountain dogs gone feral could be dangerous, especially if they had young to protect. But something about those tracks bothered him, the way they meandered, the depth of the impression suggesting exhaustion or injury. Martha's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, as clear as if she was standing beside him. "You can't just leave something suffering out there. Silas, you know you can't." She'd always been the one to bring home strays, cats, dogs, even a wounded hawk once that she'd nursed back to health in their garage. He'd grumbled about it at the time, but secretly he'd admired her inability to turn away from a creature in need. It was one of the things he'd loved most about her, that soft heart that couldn't bear to see anything suffer. He touched the wedding ring on his finger, feeling its familiar weight. 3 years of isolation, 3 years of telling himself he was better off alone, that caring about anything just led to pain. But standing here in the snow, looking at those desperate tracks, he felt something stirring in his chest that he'd thought was dead and buried with Martha. The wind picked up, sending snow spiraling across the clearing, and the first fat flakes of the coming storm began to fall. Whatever was out there in those trees, it wouldn't survive another night in the open, not in the blizzard that was coming. Silas Greer had spent 3 years learning to live without hope, without connection, without the possibility of loss. But sometimes life has other plans for a man, and sometimes those plans arrive on 4 legs, half frozen and desperate, to remind him that some things are worth the risk of caring again. Silas went back into the cabin and pulled on his heavy winter coat, the one Martha had bought him their last Christmas together. He'd almost thrown it away a dozen times, but it was the warmest thing he owned, and practicality had won out over sentiment. He grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace, not because he planned to use it, but because you didn't venture into the Montana wilderness unarmed, especially when large animals might be involved. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that stuck to his beard and limited visibility to maybe 20 yards. His boots crunched steadily through the accumulating powder as he followed the wandering trail toward the timber. The tracks were filling in fast, but he could still make them out, the large paw prints accompanied by those heartbreakingly small ones. As he got closer to the trees, a sound reached his ears that made him stop cold. It was faint, almost lost in the whisper of falling snow, but unmistakable once he heard it, whimpering, high-pitched and desperate, the kind of sound that grabbed you somewhere deep in your chest and wouldn't let go. He moved more carefully now, rifle ready but pointed down. Whatever was out there was clearly in distress, which could make it unpredictable. The last thing he needed was to get mauled by a protective mother dog, assuming that's what he was dealing with. The whimpering grew louder as he pushed through a cluster of young pines, their branches heavy with snow that dumped down his neck as he passed. And then he saw them, The mother dog lay on her side in a small depression at the base of a massive Douglas fir, her dark coat stark against the white snow. She was a beautiful animal, some kind of mix, maybe German Shepherd and something else, with intelligent brown eyes that tracked his movement but showed no fear, only exhaustion. Around her, 3 puppies no more than a few months old pressed close to her body, seeking warmth that she barely had left to give. Silas approached slowly, speaking in the gentle tone Martha had always used with injured animals. "Easy there, girl, easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog's tail gave the faintest wag, and that small gesture nearly undid him. She was dying. He could see it in her labored breathing and the way her eyes struggled to focus. But she was still trying to protect her babies, still fighting to keep them warm with her own failing body heat. He knelt in the snow beside her, setting the rifle aside. Up close, he could see she was wearing a collar, cracked leather mostly hidden beneath her thick winter coat. That meant she belonged to someone or had at one time. But what was she doing way out here, miles from the nearest human habitation? "What happened to you, girl?" he murmured, extending his hand for her to sniff. She managed to lift her head slightly, her nose touching his fingers with what felt like gratitude. "Where did you come from?" The puppies were in slightly better shape than their mother, younger, with more energy reserves, but they wouldn't last long in this cold. Already their whimpering was growing weaker, and he could see them beginning to shiver, despite being pressed against their mother's fur. Silas had faced plenty of hard decisions in his 53 years, decisions that had cost him sleep and peace of mind. But this shouldn't have been hard at all. He'd spent 3 years telling himself he was done with responsibility, done with caring about anything that could hurt him. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to walk away, let nature take its course. These weren't his animals, weren't his problem. But as he looked down at the mother dog's trusting eyes and heard the plaintive cries of her babies, he heard Martha's voice again, as clear as the day she'd died. "You've got a good heart. Silas Greer, don't you let the world make you forget that." She'd said those words to him in the hospital. Near the end, when the cancer had taken everything from her, but her ability to see the best in people. Even dying, she'd been more concerned about what would happen to him than what was happening to her. "Damn," he whispered, knowing he was about to make a choice that would complicate his carefully ordered life. But he couldn't walk away. Not from this, not when there was still a chance to save them. He scooped up the first puppy, a little female, with black fur marked by brown patches around her ears. She was cold to the touch, her tiny body trembling, but her eyes were bright and alert. The second puppy, a male with similar markings, was slightly larger and in better condition. The third, another male, was the smallest and weakest of the bunch, barely responsive when Silas picked him up. The mother dog watched him handle her babies without protest, as if she understood he meant to help. When he gently slid his arms beneath her, she didn't resist, though he could feel how much effort it took for her just to lift her head. She was heavier than he'd expected, probably close to 70 pounds of muscle and bone beneath that thick coat. But Silas was still strong, despite his years, his body hardened by 3 seasons of mountain living. He managed to get her into his arms, cradling her like a child while the puppies whined at being separated from their mother. The trip back to the cabin seemed to take forever. The snow was coming down so hard now that he could barely see 10 feet ahead, and the wind had picked up, driving the flakes horizontally across the clearing. By the time he reached his porch, his arms were aching and his lungs burned from the cold air. He managed to get the door open and stumbled inside, immediately grateful for the warmth radiating from his wood stove. The mother dog stirred in his arms as the heat hit her, lifting her head slightly and looking around the cabin with those intelligent eyes. Silas laid her gently on his braided rug in front of the fireplace, then went back outside to collect the puppies from where he'd set them on the porch. They were even colder now, their whimpering weaker, and he felt a stab of fear that he might have waited too long. Back inside, he placed the puppies next to their mother and watched as they instinctively burrowed into her fur. She managed to curl her body around them, providing what warmth she could, but it clearly cost her tremendous effort. He needed to act fast. The cabin was warm, but not warm enough for animals in this condition. He built up the fire until it was roaring, filling the small space with heat that made sweat bead on his forehead. Then he went to his bedroom and pulled every blanket he owned from the chest at the foot of his bed. Martha's blankets, the ones she'd quilted during the long winter evenings when they'd first been married. He'd packed them away after her funeral, unable to bear seeing them every day. But now he shook them out and arranged them into a nest near the fire, creating a warm, protected space for the dog family. Moving the mother dog required all his strength. She was conscious but couldn't support her own weight, her legs trembling with exhaustion and exposure. He managed to get her settled on the blankets, and immediately the puppies found their way to her, pressing close and beginning to nurse weakly. The sight of those tiny creatures fighting for life stirred something in Silas that he'd thought was permanently buried. For the first time in 3 years, he had something to focus on besides his own grief. Something that needed him. He heated water on the wood stove and found some old towels to warm the puppies' tiny bodies. The mother dog accepted his ministrations without fear, seeming to understand that he was trying to help. When he offered her water in a small bowl, she managed to drink a little, though her movements were slow and labored. As the evening wore, Silas found himself talking to them, something he hadn't done with another living creature in longer than he cared to remember. He told them about the storm outside, about how they'd be safe here until it passed. He found himself sharing stories about Martha, about how she would have loved to meet them, how she'd always had a way with animals. The mother dog's breathing gradually became less labored as the warmth soaked into her body. The puppies grew more active, nursing more vigorously and beginning to explore their soft nest with tiny, unsteady steps. But Silas could see the question in the mother dog's eyes, the same question that was forming in his own mind. What happened? Next, when the storm passed and they were strong enough to travel, then what? He'd told himself this was temporary, just until they were out of immediate danger. But as he watched them settling into sleep, the puppies curled against their mother's warm belly, he felt the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Outside, the wind howled and the snow continued to fall. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, Silas Greer's cabin felt like something more than just a place to hide from the world. It felt like a home where life was precious and worth protecting, and that scared him more than any blizzard ever could. The storm raged for 3 days, transforming the world outside into a white wilderness that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so deadly. Silas found himself grateful for the isolation it provided. He wasn't ready to think about what came after, wasn't ready to face the questions that would inevitably arise once the weather cleared. Inside the cabin, a different kind of transformation was taking place. The mother dog, whom he'd started calling Belle after glimpsing the nameplate on her collar, was slowly regaining her strength. She could lift her head without tremendous effort now, and her eyes had lost that glassy look of approaching death. The puppies were thriving, their tiny bodies growing rounder each day as they nursed and slept in endless cycles. But Silas was struggling with something he hadn't expected: the sheer disruption to his carefully ordered existence. For 3 years, his days had followed the same predictable rhythm. Now he found himself constantly checking on his unexpected guests, adjusting their blankets, keeping the fire built up higher than usual. His sleep was interrupted by puppy cries and the need to help Belle outside when her strength allowed. He'd set up a makeshift bed area using Martha's old knitting basket, lined with the softest blankets he could find. The sight of that wicker basket, which had sat empty in his bedroom for 3 years, now serving as a nursery for 3 helpless creatures, stirred emotions he wasn't prepared to handle. Martha had knitted baby blankets in that basket, back when they'd still believed children might be in their future. Before the miscarriages, before the doctors had gently explained that it simply wasn't meant to be. The puppies had distinct personalities that emerged more clearly each day. The female, whom he'd started thinking of as Patch for the brown markings around her ears, was the boldest of the three. She was always the first to explore beyond the immediate safety of her mother's side, tiny legs carrying her on wobbly adventures around the cabin. The larger male, stockier and more cautious, seemed content to stay close to Belle. The smallest, barely half the size of his siblings, concerned Silas the most. He was weaker, slower to nurse, and spent most of his time sleeping pressed tightly against his mother's warm belly. "You're a fighter, aren't you, little man?" Silas found himself saying to the smallest puppy one morning as he checked on the family. The word startled him. He hadn't spoken to another living creature in months, not counting his brief, necessary interactions in town. But something about these animals made conversation feel natural, even necessary. Belle watched him with those intelligent brown eyes, and he could swear she understood every word. There was something almost human in her gaze, a depth of understanding that went beyond simple animal instinct. When he spoke to her directly, her tail would wag weakly against the blankets, and she'd sometimes make soft huffing sounds that seemed like attempts at communication. "Where did you come from, girl?" he asked her one evening as he sat by the fire, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. "That collar says you belonged somewhere. Had a family." The word stuck in his throat. Family. He'd managed to avoid thinking about that concept for 3 years, had trained himself to believe that families were for other people, people who hadn't lost everything that mattered. But watching Belle with her puppies was forcing him to remember what family actually meant, the way she positioned her body to keep them warm even when she was exhausted, how she would gently clean them with her tongue, patient and thorough despite her own weakness. The soft sounds she made when they nursed, a low rumbling that seemed to vibrate with contentment and love. It reminded him of Martha in ways that were both painful and healing. Martha had never had children of her own to care for, but she'd poured that maternal instinct into everything around her. Her garden, the stray cats that found their way to her door, even Silas himself when he'd been sick or discouraged. She'd had that same gentle patience, that ability to put others' needs before her own, without resentment. On the 4th day, as the storm finally began to weaken, Silas made a decision that surprised him. He went to his small workshop area in the back corner of the cabin and began carving. It had been years since he'd done any woodworking beyond the purely functional, splitting logs, repairing tools, maintaining his cabin. But his hands remembered the movements, the feel of sharp tools shaping soft pine. He carved 4 small bowls, sized appropriately for the dogs. Simple, functional pieces, but he found himself taking care with the details, smoothing every surface, making sure the edges were perfectly rounded, adding small indentations that would make them easier to grip. It was mindless work in some ways, but it also required concentration that quieted the constant chatter in his head. Martha had always loved watching him work with wood. She'd say his hands looked different when he was carving, more purposeful, more at peace. He'd built her jewelry box from cherry wood, spent weeks getting every joint perfect, every surface smooth as glass. It had sat on her dresser until the day she died, holding the simple pieces she'd treasured. Her wedding ring when she'd had to remove it for medical procedures, the locket her mother had given her, a pair of earrings he'd bought her for their 10th anniversary. The memory should have hurt, but somehow, with the gentle sounds of the dog family in the background, it felt more like a warm echo than a sharp blade. He was remembering Martha as she'd lived, not as she'd died. And that felt like progress. When he finished the bowls, he filled one with fresh water and offered it to Belle. She managed to lift her head and drink deeply, her tail thumping against the blankets in what he chose to interpret as gratitude. The puppies were still too young for anything but their mother's milk, but he set the other bowls aside for when they would need them. That night, as he sat by the fire reading one of Martha's books, Jane Austen's Persuasion, about second chances and the possibility of renewed love, he found himself glancing up frequently to check on his guests. Belle was sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and strong. The puppies were arranged around her like small, furry satellites, their tiny bodies rising and falling in the rhythm of deep sleep. For the first time in 3 years, Silas felt something that might have been contentment, not happiness. That still seemed too large, too dangerous to hope for, but a quiet sense that maybe, just maybe, caring for something again wasn't a betrayal of Martha's memory. Maybe it was a way of honoring it. The smallest puppy stirred in his sleep, making tiny, squeaking sounds that tugged at something deep in Silas's chest. Without thinking, he found himself moving to the floor beside the makeshift bed, gently stroking the little creature's soft fur until he settled back into peaceful sleep. "Martha would have loved you all," he whispered into the quiet cabin, and for the first time since her death, saying her name out loud didn't feel like tearing open a wound. It felt like sharing something precious with new friends who might just understand the value of love, even when it comes wrapped in loss. 2 weeks after the storm, Silas's cabin had been transformed into something he barely recognized. Where once there had been only silence and the measured routine of solitary living, now there was constant motion, soft sounds of contentment, and an energy that seemed to pulse through every corner of the small space. Belle was strong enough now to move around freely, though she stayed close to her puppies and seemed to understand that the cabin was a safe haven. She would follow Silas with her eyes as he moved about his daily tasks, occasionally approaching to rest her head against his leg in what he'd learned was her way of saying thank you. Her recovery had been remarkable. Whatever ordeal had brought her to his doorstep seemed to be fading into memory, replaced by the simple rhythms of eating, sleeping, and caring for her young. The puppies had grown substantially, their tiny bodies filling out with healthy fat, and their movements becoming more coordinated each day. Patch, the female with the distinctive markings, had become the undisputed leader of their small pack. She was the first to explore any new area Silas opened to them, the first to investigate strange sounds, and the first to demand attention when she felt it was warranted. Her brothers had fallen into supporting roles, the larger male acting as her lieutenant in adventures, while the smallest seemed content to observe from the safety of his mother's side. Silas had started calling the larger male Scout, partly for his willingness to follow Patch into unknown territory, and partly for the way he would pause and look back at his mother before venturing too far from her side. The smallest still didn't have a name. Silas found himself reluctant to get too attached, worried that the little creature might not survive despite his apparent progress. But survive he was. Slowly, gradually, the smallest puppy was gaining weight and strength. His eyes, which had seemed dull and unfocused those first few days, now tracked movement with bright intelligence. He'd begun to venture short distances from Belle's side, though he tired quickly and would return to nurse and nap, pressed against her warm fur. Silas found his daily routine completely reorganized around his four-legged guests. He'd moved his sleeping area to the main room, using blankets and pillows to create a makeshift bed on the floor near the fireplace. Partly this was practical. He needed to keep the fire going through the night to maintain warmth, but mostly it was because he'd discovered he slept better when he could hear the quiet sounds of the dog family nearby. The wooden bowls he'd carved had become essential equipment. Belle ate with delicate precision from the largest one, somehow managing to keep her meals neat despite her size. He'd started adding warm broth to her dry food, remembering how Martha had done the same for a stray cat she'd nursed back to health years ago. The memory had come unbidden, but instead of the sharp pain he'd expected, it brought a gentle warmth, as if Martha's spirit was somehow present in these small acts of care. He'd also begun modifying the cabin itself to accommodate his guests. A section of the porch had been enclosed with scrap lumber to create a sheltered outdoor area where Belle could relieve herself without having to venture into the deep snow. He'd built low barriers to keep the puppies from wandering into dangerous areas, and had moved anything breakable or valuable to higher shelves. The changes should have bothered him, For 3 years, he'd maintained his space with military precision, everything in its place, every surface clean and uncluttered. Now there were blankets scattered around the main room, water bowls that needed constant refilling, and toys improvised from pieces of rope and wood scraps. But instead of feeling invaded or disrupted, he found the controlled chaos oddly comforting. It reminded him of the early years of his marriage, when Martha had gradually civilized his bachelor apartment with plants and pictures, soft furniture and touches of color. He'd grumbled about the changes at first. Where was he supposed to put his beer when every surface had a doily or a vase of flowers? But gradually, he'd come to love the warmth and life she'd brought to his sterile space. Belle seemed to sense his growing attachment and had begun to seek out his company even when she didn't need anything. She would settle near his feet while he worked at his small table or rest her head on his lap while he read in the evenings. Her presence was undemanding, but somehow essential, like a living reminder that solitude didn't have to mean loneliness. The puppies had discovered that Silas was a source of entertainment as well as care. Patch had developed a game of attacking his bootlaces whenever he sat down, growling with mock ferocity at the leather strips. Scout preferred to wrestle with any piece of clothing that hung within reach, tugging determinedly at shirt sleeves and pant legs. Even the smallest had begun to show interest in play, though his games were gentler and required frequent rest breaks. Silas found himself talking to them constantly now, narrating his activities and sharing thoughts he hadn't spoken aloud in years. He told them about the weather, how the morning frost patterns predicted the day's temperature, how the wind direction affected when storms would arrive. He explained his daily tasks, why the firewood needed to be split to certain sizes, how to read the signs that indicated when his food stores were running low. But increasingly, he found himself sharing memories of Martha, how she'd insisted on hanging wind chimes on the porch of their house in Missoula, claiming they brought good luck, how she'd saved every stray animal in the neighborhood, turning their garage into a temporary veterinary clinic, how she'd sung while she cooked old songs from her childhood that she claimed helped the food taste better. Belle would listen with those intelligent eyes, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed like responses. The puppies would tumble around his feet while he talked, providing a constant, gentle distraction from the weight of remembering. One evening, as he sat by the fire, with Patch asleep in his lap and Scout draped across his feet, Silas realized that for the first time since Martha's death, he was looking forward to tomorrow. Not just enduring it, not just surviving until it ended, but actually anticipating what the new day might bring. The smallest puppy chose that moment to attempt his longest journey yet from Belle's side, wobbling determinedly across the cabin floor towards Silas with tiny tail wagging. When the little creature finally reached him and collapsed in an exhausted heap against his leg, Silas made a decision. "Runt," he said softly, gently stroking the puppy's soft fur. "I think your name is Runt, not because you're small, but because you're a fighter. Fighters deserve respect." Belle lifted her head from where she'd been dozing and looked at him with what he could swear was approval. Outside, the wind continued its eternal song through the pine trees. But inside the cabin, something had fundamentally shifted. Silas Greer was no longer just hiding from the world. He was building something new in its place. March brought the first hints of spring to the Bitterroot Mountains, longer days, warmer afternoons, and the steady drip of snow melting from the cabin's eaves. But with the changing season came a crisis that shattered Silas's growing sense of contentment and forced him to confront the possibility of loss all over again. Belle had been acting strangely for 2 days, restless and uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with the warming weather. She'd stopped eating with her usual enthusiasm, picking at the food in her carved bowl with obvious reluctance. Her breathing had become labored again, reminiscent of those first terrible days when she'd barely clung to life. Most troubling of all, she'd begun to separate herself from the puppies, moving to the far corner of the cabin and lying with her head pressed against the cool stone of the fireplace. Silas watched her with growing alarm, recognizing the signs of serious illness. He'd seen enough suffering, both in animals and humans, to know when something was fundamentally wrong. The puppies, now almost 3 months old and far more aware of their surroundings, seemed to sense their mother's distress. They would approach her tentatively, whining softly, then retreat when she failed to respond with her usual gentle attention. "Come on, girl," Silas murmured, kneeling beside her on the third morning of her decline. "You've got to eat something. Your babies need you strong." But Belle only lifted her head slightly, her brown eyes clouded with a pain he couldn't understand. When he offered her water, she managed a few laps before turning away. When he brought her favorite treat, pieces of jerky he'd been saving for special occasions, she sniffed them, politely but showed no interest. The sight of her suffering brought back memories Silas had worked hard to bury. Martha, in those final weeks, when the cancer had stolen her appetite and made every breath a struggle. The helpless frustration of watching someone he loved fade away, despite everything he tried to do. The crushing realization that love and determination weren't always enough to save what mattered most. He'd promised himself he wouldn't go through that again, wouldn't care enough about any living creature to experience that particular brand of agony. But here he was, 3 years later, feeling his heart twist with the same desperate fear. In the small bedroom that had served as his storage area, Silas kept a wooden box that hadn't been opened since he'd moved to the mountains. Inside were Martha's medical supplies, herbs she'd collected and dried, remedies she'd learned from her grandmother, the small glass bottles and cloth pouches that had been her pharmacy for treating everything from headaches to stomach ailments. Martha had been raised by a woman who believed in the healing power of plants, a grandmother who'd maintained an extensive garden of medicinal herbs and passed down centuries-old knowledge about their proper use. Martha had absorbed those lessons eagerly, creating her own collection of natural remedies that she'd used to treat neighbors' ailments when doctors were too expensive or too far away. The medicine pouch was a small leather bag, worn soft from handling, that contained packets of dried herbs wrapped in paper and labeled in Martha's careful handwriting. Willow bark for pain, echinacea for infections, calendula for wounds, chamomile for anxiety and digestive troubles. Each packet was a testament to her caring nature and her belief that healing was a sacred responsibility. Silas had avoided this box for 3 years, unable to bear the sight of Martha's handwriting or the smell of the dried plants that had filled their kitchen during her preparation sessions. But now, with Belle suffering and the puppies watching their mother with confused distress, he forced himself to open it. The familiar scent hit him immediately, lavender and sage, rosemary and thyme, all the plants that had made their house smell like a garden, even in the dead of winter. For a moment, he was transported back to their kitchen, watching Martha work at the stove with her sleeves pushed up and her dark hair pulled back, humming softly as she prepared tinctures and teas for whoever needed them. "I need your help, Martha," he whispered to the empty air. "I don't know what's wrong with her, but you would have. You always knew." He spread the packets on his table, trying to remember the conversations he'd half listened to when Martha had explained her remedies to friends and neighbors. Belle's symptoms, loss of appetite, labored breathing, lethargy, could indicate several different problems. But one memory stood out clearly: Mrs. Henderson's old dog, who'd suffered from similar symptoms until Martha had diagnosed it as a digestive inflammation and treated it with a tea made from chamomile and ginger. Working carefully, following instincts more than knowledge, Silas prepared a gentle infusion using Martha's dried chamomile and some fresh ginger root from his limited supplies. The process was meditative, requiring attention to detail and patience, qualities that helped quiet the panic threatening to overwhelm his rational thought. When the tea had cooled to room temperature, he brought it to Belle in one of the smaller carved bowls. She looked up at him with those trusting brown eyes, and he felt the weight of her faith in his ability to help her. "This is from Martha," he told her, gently stroking her head. "She knew about healing. She would have wanted to help you." Belle managed to drink nearly half the bowl, more liquid than she'd taken in the past 2 days. Silas felt a flicker of hope. quickly suppressed by the memory of how many false hopes he'd harbored during Martha's illness. The puppies, sensing that something important was happening, gathered close to their mother. Patch pressed against Belle's side, while Scout positioned himself where he could keep watch over both his mother and his siblings. Runt, still the smallest but no longer the weakest, climbed carefully onto Belle's back and settled there like a small, warm blanket. As evening approached, Silas found himself keeping vigil beside the dog family, much as he'd done during those first critical nights after the storm. But this time, instead of focusing on the immediate crisis, he found himself thinking about the broader pattern of his life, how caring for others inevitably led to the possibility of losing them, but how the alternative, a life without caring, wasn't really living at all. Martha's medicine pouch lay open beside him, its contents representing years of knowledge and compassion. She'd always said that healing wasn't just about the right herbs or the correct dosage. It was about the intention behind the treatment, the love that motivated the care. Looking down at Belle, who seemed to be resting more peacefully after the chamomile tea, Silas realized that using Martha's remedies didn't feel like betraying her memory or dwelling in the past. It felt like honoring her legacy, carrying forward the part of her that had believed healing was always possible, even when the outcome remained uncertain. Outside, the spring wind stirred the pine boughs, and somewhere in the distance, a loon called across the still water of the mountain lake. Inside the cabin, a man who'd thought he'd lost the ability to hope sat beside a suffering animal and remembered what it meant to fight for something precious. Even when the odds seemed impossible, Belle's recovery over the following week was nothing short of miraculous. The chamomile tea, administered twice daily with the patience and precision Martha would have approved of, seemed to settle whatever inflammation had been troubling her digestive system. Her appetite returned gradually, then with enthusiasm that reminded Silas of her fierce determination to survive those first critical days. The labored breathing eased, and she began to move with something approaching, a former grace and strength, but it was during those quiet hours of nursing Belle back to health that Silas made a discovery that would change everything he thought he understood about his four-legged guests. He'd been carefully cleaning Belle's collar, working the dried mud and debris from the leather with warm water and gentle soap, when something unusual caught his attention. The collar was well made, clearly expensive, with brass fittings that had tarnished but not corroded, despite whatever ordeal had brought Belle to his mountain sanctuary. The nameplate he'd glimpsed before was clearer now, Belle engraved in elegant script, with a phone number beneath it that he recognized as having a Montana area code, but tucked behind the nameplate, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it, was something that made his breath catch in his throat. A small object had been carefully secured beneath the brass plate, wrapped in what appeared to be oiled cloth to protect it from moisture. Working with the patience of a man who understood that some discoveries couldn't be rushed, Silas managed to extract the hidden item without damaging Belle's collar. It was a wooden toy horse, carved from what looked like pine and worn smooth by small hands. No bigger than his thumb, simple in design, but clearly made with love and attention to detail. The kind of toy a father might carve for his daughter during long winter evenings, or that a grandfather might create to amuse a beloved grandchild. The sight of it hit Silas like a physical blow. This wasn't just evidence that Belle had belonged to a family. It was proof that she'd been part of a family with children. Someone small enough to treasure a toy horse, someone who'd cared enough about Belle to ensure she carried a piece of home with her wherever she went. Belle seemed to sense the significance of his discovery. She approached him carefully, sniffing the toy horse with obvious recognition. Her tail wagged slowly, and she made a soft whining sound that seemed to carry both joy and sadness. She knew this object. It meant something to her beyond simple familiarity. "Where is she, girl?" Silas asked, holding the toy horse where Belle could see it clearly. "Where's the little one who gave you this?" Belle's response was immediate and unmistakable. She moved to the cabin door and looked back at him expectantly, her whole body tense with purpose. When he didn't immediately follow, she returned to him, gently took his sleeve in her teeth and tugged toward the door. The message was clear. She wanted to show him something, to lead him somewhere. But outside, the March weather was treacherous, warm enough during the day to melt snow and create treacherous mud, cold enough at night to freeze everything into hazardous ice. The trails he'd used all winter were now impassable ribbons of slush and standing water. Whatever Belle wanted to show him would have to wait for more stable conditions. The puppies, now fully weaned and energetic beyond belief, had transformed the cabin into their personal playground. Patch had established herself as the undisputed alpha, organizing elaborate games that usually involved stealing something of Silas's and engaging her brothers in spirited tug-of-war competitions. Scout had developed an obsession with his own reflection in the cabin's single mirror, spending long minutes barking at and attempting to intimidate what he clearly perceived as a rival dog. Runt, true to his fighter's spirit, had claimed the largest and most comfortable sleeping spot near the fireplace, defending it against his siblings with a determination that made Silas chuckle, despite the weight of his new discovery. But even as he watched their antics with growing affection, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The toy horse seemed to pulse with urgency, a silent reminder that somewhere out there, a child might be waiting for Belle to come home, or worse, might be beyond waiting, might be lost forever to whatever catastrophe had separated this family in the first place. The ethical dilemma was becoming clear. Belle wasn't a stray who'd happened upon his property by chance. She was someone's beloved pet, possibly someone's lifeline, and her presence in his cabin represented a profound disruption to another family's life. The right thing to do, the honorable thing, would be to return her to her original home as soon as the weather permitted travel. But the thought of losing Belle, and by extension the puppies who'd brought such unexpected joy to his solitary existence, filled him with a dread that surprised him with its intensity. Somewhere along the way, without quite realizing it, he'd begun to think of them as his family. The cabin was their home now, and he was their protector and provider. The idea of sending them away felt like voluntary amputation. Late that night, as he sat by the dying fire with the toy horse resting in his palm, Silas found himself thinking about the different kinds of love and obligation that could pull a man in opposite directions. There was the love he'd developed for Belle and her puppies, immediate, protective, grounded in daily care and growing attachment. But there was also the love someone else might be feeling. A child who went to sleep each night, wondering if her dog was safe. Parents who'd lost not just a pet, but a family member. Martha would have known what to do. She'd always had an instinctive understanding of what was right, even when right wasn't easy. She would have looked at that toy horse and seen not a threat to her own happiness, but a little girl's treasure that needed to find its way home. Belle stirred in her sleep, and one of the puppies, Scout, he thought, mumbled in whatever dreams young dogs have. The sound was peaceful, content, and it struck Silas that this might be the calm before the storm. Soon, very soon, he would have to make decisions that would change all their lives. He carefully wrapped the toy horse back in its protective cloth and returned it to its hiding place behind Belle's nameplate. Whatever choice he ultimately made, he owed it to that unknown child to keep her gift safe until he could determine where it and Belle truly belonged. Outside, an owl called through the darkness, its voice carrying across the mountains with a loneliness that echoed in Silas's chest. Inside the warm cabin, a family slept peacefully, unaware that their safe haven might soon become just another way station on a journey that would lead them back into a larger world, filled with both love and loss. The photograph changed everything. Silas discovered it on a morning in late March when the spring sun had finally gained enough strength to begin the serious work of melting winter's grip on the mountains. He'd been working on Belle's collar again, this time trying to repair a section where the leather had cracked, when his fingers found something else hidden beneath the brass nameplate, something he'd missed in his previous examination. It was wrapped in the same oiled cloth as the toy horse, but this package was flatter, more delicate. When he carefully unfolded the protective covering, he found himself looking at a photograph that made his hands tremble and his heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. The image was slightly blurred, creased from handling, but clear enough to tell a story that hit him like a physical blow. It showed Belle, younger and sleeker, sitting beside a small girl who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. The child had dark hair, pulled back in pigtails, and was wearing what looked like a blue dress with white flowers. Her arms were wrapped around Belle's neck, and both of them were looking at the camera with the kind of complete happiness that only exists in perfect moments. But it was the background of the photograph that sent ice through Silas's veins. Behind the girl and the dog, he could make out the charred remains of what had once been a cabin. Smoke still rose from the blackened timbers, and emergency vehicles were visible at the edges of the frame. This wasn't a happy family portrait, it was a documentation of disaster. With the photograph still clutched in his shaking hands, Silas sank into his chair by the fireplace. Belle approached him immediately, as if sensing his distress, and pressed her head against his leg. The gesture, which had become so familiar and comforting over the past months, now carried a weight of tragedy he could barely comprehend. "My God, Belle," he whispered, looking down into those intelligent brown eyes. "What happened to your family?" The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. Belle hadn't been abandoned or lost. She'd been fleeing a catastrophe. The photograph suggested a house fire, which would explain her condition when he'd found her, exhausted and desperate in the snow. She'd been trying to save her puppies, trying to find safety in a world that had suddenly become dangerous and unfamiliar. But where was the little girl in the photograph? The child who'd loved Belle enough to hide her picture in the dog's collar, who'd carved a toy horse for her beloved pet. The absence of any human presence in Belle's desperate flight suggested possibilities too terrible to consider directly. Silas forced himself to examine the photograph more carefully, looking for any details that might provide clues about when and where it had been taken. The emergency vehicles looked official, fire trucks and ambulances, which meant there would be records. The style of the girl's dress and the quality of the photograph suggested it was recent, probably within the last year. As he studied the image, a memory surfaced from his monthly trips to town. Conversations overheard in the general store, fragments of local news that he'd paid little attention to at the time. Something about a cabin fire, a family lost, a child missing and presumed dead. The details had been sketchy, filtered through the kind of whispered gossip that small mountain communities specialized in. But now they took on a significance that made his chest tight with dread. The Morrison family. That was the name he remembered now. Jim and Ellen Morrison, who'd lived in a remote cabin about 15 miles northwest of Whitefish Creek. They'd had a daughter, Sarah. He thought the name was, and had been known for keeping to themselves, living off the grid in much the same way Silas had chosen to do. The fire had happened in early winter, November or December, and the official search had been called off after weeks of finding no trace of the missing child. Belle's behavior over the past few days suddenly made perfect sense. Her restlessness, her tendency to pace by the door, the way she'd tried to lead him outside despite the dangerous conditions. She'd been trying to go home, or to the place where home used to be. More than that, she'd been trying to show him something, to communicate information he'd been too focused on his own concerns to understand. The implications were staggering. If Sarah Morrison was still alive, still out there somewhere in the wilderness, then every day of delay could be the difference between rescue and tragedy. But the official search had been called off months ago, which meant the authorities had concluded she was beyond saving. How could an 8-year-old child survive a Montana winter in the wilderness without shelter or supplies? Yet Belle's desperate journey to his cabin, her protective care of her puppies in the face of impossible odds, suggested that survival against overwhelming odds was possible. If Belle could keep 3 helpless puppies alive through the worst winter in recent memory, Perhaps a resourceful child with some survival knowledge could have found a way to endure. The toy horse took on new meaning in light of the photograph. It wasn't just a treasured possession. It was a message, a way of ensuring that if something happened to the family, Belle would carry proof of Sarah's existence with her. The child had been thinking ahead, planning for disasters that adults might have dismissed as impossible. Silas stood abruptly, startling Belle, who'd been dozing at his feet. The dog immediately came alert, sensing the change in his mood, and moved to the cabin door with that expectant posture he'd learned to recognize. She wanted to go. She'd been wanting to go for weeks, waiting for him to understand what she was trying to tell him. But understanding brought its own paralyzing weight of responsibility. If Sarah Morrison was alive, if she was waiting somewhere in the mountains for Belle to return, then Silas was possibly the only person who could save her. The authorities had given up. Her parents were dead. There was no one else who knew what Belle knew. No one else who could interpret her desperate attempts at communication. The ethical dilemma he'd been wrestling with, whether to keep the dogs or try to return them to their original family, had just become a life-or-death decision. It was no longer about his attachment to Belle and the puppies, or even about doing the right thing by some abstract moral standard. It was about a child who might be counting on Belle's return, who might be surviving on faith that her beloved dog would somehow find a way to bring help. Martha's voice seemed to whisper in his ear with the clarity of absolute certainty. "You know what you have to do." "Silas, you've always known." But knowing and doing were different things entirely. Silas had spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility, this kind of risk. Getting involved meant opening himself up to the possibility of failure, of arriving too late, of discovering that hope was just another word for self-deception. It meant leaving his sanctuary and venturing back into a world where terrible things happened to innocent people, and love wasn't enough to protect what mattered most. He looked down at Belle, who was watching him with those trusting eyes, waiting for him to make the decision that would determine whether Sarah Morrison lived or died. In her gaze, he saw an echo of Martha's unwavering faith in his fundamental decency, her belief that when the moment came, he would choose courage over comfort, love over safety. Outside, the spring sun continued its work of freeing the mountains from winter's grip, creating the conditions that would make travel possible, but not easy. Inside the cabin, a man who'd thought he'd finished with heroism was discovering that some calls to action couldn't be ignored. No matter how much it cost to answer them, the photograph lay on his table like an accusation and a promise. Somewhere in the wilderness, a little girl might be waiting for her dog to come home. And Silas Greer, whether he was ready or not, was about to find out if 3 years of hiding had destroyed his capacity to be the man Martha had always believed him to be. The decision, once made, consumed Silas with an urgency that reminded him of his military days, the focused intensity that came with accepting a mission where failure meant lives lost. He had perhaps 2 weeks before the spring melt would make mountain travel truly treacherous. 2 weeks to find a little girl who'd been missing for nearly 5 months. From a wooden chest beneath his bed, Silas retrieved items he hadn't touched since coming to the mountains, gear from his 20-year career in the Army Corps of Engineers, much of it from his time attached to search and rescue operations in Afghanistan and Kosovo. His father's compass, a Civil War relic passed down through 3 generations of Greer men, felt familiar and substantial in his hands. The brass case was tarnished, but the needle still pointed true north, just as it had guided his great-grandfather through the wilderness of Virginia, his grandfather through the forests of France, and his father through the jungles of Vietnam. The compass wasn't just a navigation tool. It was a reminder of the men who'd come before him, all of whom had faced impossible odds and found ways to do what needed doing. Silas had carried it through his own impossible places, and now it would help him navigate the most important mission of his life. He spent 2 days preparing with the methodical thoroughness that had kept him alive in hostile territory. His backpack, military surplus and built to carry a man's life for weeks, was loaded with carefully selected supplies, high-energy food that wouldn't spoil, water purification tablets, first aid supplies including some of Martha's medicinal herbs, emergency shelter materials, extra clothing, and his service pistol cleaned, loaded, and holstered where he could reach it quickly. The weather was the critical variable. Each morning he checked the sky, reading clouds and wind patterns with the expertise of someone who'd learned that accurate forecasts could mean the difference between life and death. The spring conditions were treacherous but manageable. Snow still deep in shaded areas but melting rapidly in direct sunlight, creating streams and mudslides that could trap or kill the unwary. Belle watched his preparations with growing excitement, as if she understood that action was finally being taken. Her behavior became increasingly focused, spending long periods standing by the door or looking out the single window toward the northwest, the direction she'd consistently indicated when he'd asked her where she wanted to go. The puppies presented a problem he hadn't initially considered. At 4 months old, they were too large to carry, but not yet strong enough for the kind of grueling mountain travel that lay ahead. Patch might be able to manage some of the distance, but Scout, and especially Runt, would be liabilities in terrain that would challenge even experienced hikers. The solution, when it came to him, was both practical and painful. He would leave the puppies at the cabin with enough food and water to last a week, betting that Belle would lead him to Sarah quickly or not at all. The puppies were resourceful enough to survive for a limited time, and if he didn't return within 7 days, they would at least have a chance to find their way to lower ground where someone might discover them. He spent an entire evening reinforcing the puppy barriers around the cabin, ensuring they couldn't get into anything dangerous but could access food, water, and the outdoor area he'd enclosed. Watching Patch attempt to follow him outside, only to be gently but firmly redirected back to the safety of the cabin, nearly broke his resolve. These creatures had become family to him, and leaving them felt like abandonment. But Belle's urgency was infectious. Every delay, every moment spent on preparations, seemed to increase her restlessness. She would pace between him and the door, occasionally letting out soft whines that sounded remarkably like human words of encouragement or frustration. Time was running out for someone, and Belle knew it. On the morning of departure, Silas performed one final ritual that connected him to both his past and his uncertain future. He removed Martha's wedding ring from his finger, not to abandon her memory, but to carry it in a different way. He placed the ring on a chain around his neck, where it would rest close to his heart, but not interfere with the use of his hands. The gesture felt like blessing rather than goodbye, as if Martha's love was joining the mission rather than being left behind. "Keep an eye on them for me," he whispered to the empty air, looking back at the puppies who were pressed against the window, watching him with confused disappointment. "Keep them safe until I get back." Belle waited by his side as he shouldered his pack and checked his gear one final time. She was alert and eager, her posture radiating confidence that he would follow where she led. In her bearing, Silas could see the ghost of the dog she'd been before the tragedy, well-trained, intelligent, completely trustworthy in the wilderness. Sarah Morrison had chosen her companion well. The early morning air was crisp, but not bitter, perfect for hard travel. Snow crunched under his boots as they left the cabin's clearing and entered the forest proper, Belle leading with the purposeful gait of someone who knew exactly where she was going. The direction was northwest, just as she'd been indicating for weeks, toward the remote drainage where the Morrison family had made their home. As they climbed higher into the mountains, following game trails and deer paths that wound between towering pines and across open meadows still buried in snow, Silas found his military training reasserting itself. His pace became measured and sustainable, his breathing controlled, his awareness heightened to every sight and sound that might indicate danger or opportunity. The physical demands of mountain travel, which had seemed daunting when viewed from the comfort of his cabin, felt manageable once he was actually moving. Belle proved to be an excellent traveling companion. She stayed close enough to maintain visual contact, but ranged ahead to scout the trail, always returning to guide him around obstacles or dangerous terrain. Her knowledge of the mountains was impressive. She seemed to know which snow-covered slopes were stable and which might avalanche, which streams could be safely crossed and which were too swift or deep. By midday, they'd covered nearly 8 miles of difficult terrain, climbing steadily toward the high country where winter held on longest. Silas called a rest stop beside a small stream that ran clear and cold with snowmelt, and while he ate trail rations and consulted his compass, Belle drank deeply and then stood sentinel, scanning the surrounding forest with alert attention. It was during this rest that Silas began to find the first signs that they were on the right track. Caught on a low branch beside the stream was a piece of blue fabric, weathered and faded but unmistakably from human clothing. Belle sniffed it with obvious recognition, her tail wagging slowly, and when Silas examined it more closely, he could see that it matched the color of the dress Sarah had been wearing in the photograph. The fabric was old. It had been here for months, exposed to weather and wildlife. But its presence meant that Sarah had passed this way, probably during her initial flight from whatever catastrophe had befallen her family. She'd been moving in the same direction Belle was leading him now, deeper into the wilderness, toward terrain that would provide shelter but also isolation. As they resumed their journey, climbing higher into country that few humans ever saw, Silas felt the weight of his father's compass in his pocket and the warmth of Martha's ring against his chest. He was following a trail that was 5 months old, looking for a child who might no longer exist, guided by a dog whose loyalty had already cost her everything once. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt like himself again, not the broken hermit who'd been hiding in the mountains, but the man Martha had married, the soldier who'd never left anyone behind, the person who understood that some risks were worth taking because the alternative was unacceptable. Ahead of him, Belle paused at the crest of a ridge and looked back, as if checking to make sure he was still following. In her gaze, he saw something that looked remarkably like hope, the belief that this time, help would arrive in time, that loyalty and determination might be enough to perform one more miracle. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered peaks that stretched endlessly in every direction. Somewhere in this vast wilderness, if Belle was right, if his growing conviction was justified, Sarah Morrison was waiting for her dog to come home. And Silas Greer, carrying the compass of his fathers and the blessing of his dead wife, was finally ready to be the kind of man who answered when hope called his name. The trail grew more treacherous as they climbed higher, but Belle's certainty never wavered. She led Silas along ridges where the wind had scoured the snow down to bare rock, across slopes where a single misstep could trigger a slide that would bury them both. Her mountain wisdom, learned through months of desperate survival, kept them moving forward when his military training might have counseled retreat. By late afternoon, they'd reached a landscape that seemed to exist at the edge of the world, a high valley surrounded by peaks that caught clouds and held them like prisoners. The air was thin here, making each breath a conscious effort, and the silence was so complete that Silas could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. It was Belle who found the second piece of evidence, her nose leading her to a depression in the snow where something had been cached and later retrieved. Silas brushed away the loose powder and found himself looking at the remnants of a shelter. Pine boughs arranged in a pattern that spoke of human intelligence, rocks positioned to break the wind, the blackened remains of a small fire pit. Someone had lived here, at least temporarily. Someone who knew enough about survival to build adequate shelter and maintain fire in conditions that would kill most people within hours. The site was old, probably from early winter, but it proved that Sarah Morrison had not only survived the initial catastrophe, but had possessed the knowledge and determination to keep herself alive in the wilderness. Near the fire pit, partially buried in snow that had accumulated over months of storms, Silas discovered something that made his throat tight with emotion. A small rag doll, clearly handmade, with yarn hair and a dress stitched from scraps of fabric. One arm was missing, and the face was stained with weather and wear, but it remained recognizably a cherished toy. Belle approached the doll with obvious recognition, sniffing it gently before sitting back on her haunches and looking at Silas with eyes that seemed to say, "She was here. She's real. She's waiting." The doll was proof of life, evidence that Sarah had survived long enough to establish this camp and care for her possessions. But it also raised troubling questions. If she'd been here in early winter, where was she now? The shelter showed no signs of recent use, and the fire pit was cold beneath its covering of snow. Belle provided the answer by moving to the far side of the valley and beginning to climb again, following what appeared to be another game trail that wound higher into the mountains. Her behavior had changed. Instead of the steady, purposeful pace she'd maintained all day, she now moved with increasing urgency, pausing frequently to look back and ensure Silas was keeping up. The trail Belle followed was barely visible, more suggestion than reality, threading between massive boulders and upslopes so steep that Silas found himself using his hands as much as his feet. But there were signs if you knew how to read them. Broken branches at the height a small person might grab for support, scratches in the stone where boots had scraped for purchase, the occasional clear footprint in patches of protected snow. Someone had passed this way recently, within the last few weeks at most. Someone small and light, someone who knew these mountains well enough to navigate them in conditions that would challenge experienced mountaineers. Sarah Morrison had not just survived, she'd adapted, learned, grown into a creature of the wilderness that rivaled Belle's own expertise. As the afternoon wore on, and shadows began to gather in the deepest ravines, Belle's urgency became almost frantic. She would climb 20 or 30 yards ahead, then return to encourage Silas forward, her whines and body language clearly communicating that time was running out for something important. The terrain leveled out briefly as they reached another high valley, this one narrower and more protected than the last. Here the snow lay deeper, undisturbed by wind, and the silence was so profound that Silas could hear the distant crack of settling ice from glaciers hidden among the peaks. Belle stopped suddenly, her head raised and ears alert, listening to something beyond human perception. Then, without warning, she began to bark, not the casual woofing she'd done around the cabin, but urgent, purposeful barks that echoed off the surrounding peaks like gunshots. From somewhere ahead, faint but unmistakable, came an answering call. Not another dog, but something that made Silas's heart race with hope and terror. A human voice, high and thin with distance, calling Belle's name across the vast emptiness of the mountain wilderness. "Belle! Belle, is that you?" The voice was young, female, and alive. Sarah Morrison, against all odds and official pronouncements, had survived 5 months in the Montana wilderness. She was calling for her dog with the desperate joy of someone who'd given up hope and found it. Restored, Silas felt his knees nearly buckle with relief and the overwhelming weight of success that had seemed impossible just hours before. They'd found her. The little girl in the photograph, the owner of the toy horse and the rag doll, the child whose love for Belle had been strong enough to hide messages of hope in a dog's collar. She was alive, and she was close. Belle was already running toward the sound, her barks becoming a continuous celebration of reunion. Silas followed as quickly as the thin air and treacherous terrain would allow, his heart pounding with more than just exertion. After 3 years of hiding from the world and its sorrows, he was about to participate in a miracle. Belle disappeared into a cluster of massive granite boulders that rose like ancient sentinels from the valley floor, her barks echoing off the stone in a joyful cacophony that seemed to wake the sleeping mountains. Silas followed as quickly as he could manage, his breath coming in short gasps in the thin air, his military training warring with pure human emotion as he approached what might be the most important moment of his life. The rocks formed a natural maze, carved by millennia of wind and weather into passages barely wide enough for a human body. Belle's voice guided him through the labyrinth, leading him deeper into a hidden sanctuary that no casual observer would ever discover. The walls rose higher as he progressed, blocking out most of the late afternoon sun and creating a cool, protected environment that would be invisible from above. And then he saw her. Sarah Morrison sat in a small clearing at the heart of the rock formation, her arms wrapped around Belle's neck, tears streaming down a face that had been aged beyond its years by hardship and loss. She was smaller than he'd expected from the photograph, thin in the way of someone who'd learned to survive on minimal rations. But her eyes held an intelligence and strength that spoke of the incredible journey she'd traveled. She wore multiple layers of clothing, all clearly scavenged or improvised, a man's coat that hung to her knees over what looked like several sweaters, boots that were too large and had been stuffed with what appeared to be pine needles for insulation. Her dark hair was longer than in the photograph, braided back in a practical style that kept it out of her face. But despite the hardships written in every line of her posture, she was unmistakably alive, whole, and alert. The reunion between Belle and Sarah was everything Silas had hoped for, and more. The dog covered the girl's face with kisses, while Sarah buried her fingers in Belle's fur, both of them making sounds of pure joy that needed no translation. This was love in its most fundamental form, loyalty tested by impossible circumstances and proven stronger than death itself. But it was what Sarah held in her free hand that nearly undid Silas completely. A small wooden cross, carved from pine and smoothed by months of handling, crude but unmistakably crafted with care and intention. It was the kind of thing someone might make during long, lonely hours when hope was the only thing standing between survival and surrender. "I knew you'd come back," Sarah was whispering to Belle, her voice hoarse with emotion and disuse. "I knew you'd find a way. I kept the fire going just like Daddy taught me, and I saved your horse. And I made this to help me remember that God watches over lost things." The cross represented something beyond mere survival. It was evidence of faith maintained in the face of overwhelming odds, of a child who'd faced the death of her parents and months of isolation without losing her fundamental belief that rescue was possible. Silas approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, but Sarah had already noticed him. Her eyes, while wary, showed no real fear, perhaps because Belle's obvious trust in him provided all the recommendation she needed. "Are you the man Belle found?" she asked with the directness of childhood. "She told me she was going to find someone to help. I didn't know dogs could do that, but Belle's special. She saved me when our house burned down. She got me away from the fire and showed me how to get to the safe places in the mountains." The story emerged gradually as Sarah's initial caution gave way to the relief of finally having someone to talk to. The fire had started in the middle of the night, a propane heater malfunction that had turned their remote cabin into an inferno within minutes. Her parents had died trying to fight the blaze, but Belle had somehow gotten Sarah out of the house and led her away from the flames. In the months that followed, Belle had taught Sarah to survive in ways that seemed almost mystical. The dog had shown her which plants were safe to eat, how to find water in winter, where to build shelters that would protect her from storms and predators. When Belle had disappeared in February, heavy with puppies and driven by instincts Sarah couldn't understand, the girl had established a permanent camp in this hidden sanctuary and waited with the absolute faith of childhood that her protector would return. "I knew she wouldn't leave me forever," Sarah explained, scratching Belle behind the ears. "She just had to take care of her babies first. That's what mamas do, they take care of their babies. But I knew she'd come back with help." The wooden cross caught the last rays of sunlight filtering down between the rocks, and Silas realized he was looking at something far more significant than a simple survival tool. It was a testament to the power of hope to sustain life against impossible odds, proof that faith and love could indeed move mountains, or at least help a small girl survive, alone in their shadow. But even as he marveled at Sarah's resilience and Belle's incredible loyalty, Silas knew that the hardest part of their mission still lay ahead. Getting Sarah down from these mountains alive would require every bit of skill and determination he possessed, and weather that had been merely challenging for a healthy adult would be potentially fatal for a child weakened by months of marginal nutrition and exposure. The rescue was only beginning. 6 months later, Silas stood on the porch of his cabin watching Sarah teach the 3 puppies, now grown into gangly adolescents, how to fetch properly. The morning air carried the crisp promise of another Montana winter. But this year, the approaching season held no dread, only the comfortable anticipation of long evenings by the fire with his new family. The journey down from Sarah's mountain sanctuary had taken 3 days of careful travel, with Silas carrying the weakened girl on his back for much of the distance, and Belle serving as advance scout and guardian. They'd made it to the ranger station at Whitefish Creek just as a late spring blizzard had moved in, sealing off the high country for another 2 weeks. The timing had been nothing short of miraculous. What followed had been a whirlwind of medical examinations, legal proceedings, and media attention that had threatened to overwhelm them all. Sarah was severely malnourished and suffering from exposure, but her underlying health was remarkably good, a testament to Belle's guidance and her own incredible resilience. The doctors had marveled at her survival, calling it impossible, but Silas had seen enough impossible things in his life to know they happened more often than people wanted to believe. The legal arrangements had been simpler than expected. With no living relatives and her parents' estate consisting mainly of the burned cabin and surrounding land, Sarah had become a ward of the state. But Silas's military record, his stable living situation, and most importantly, Sarah's absolute insistence that she wanted to stay with him and Belle, had smoothed the path to guardianship. The cabin had been expanded to accommodate its new residents. Silas had spent the summer building a proper second bedroom for Sarah, complete with windows that looked out over the valley and shelves for the growing collection of books they'd ordered from town. The main room had been reconfigured to include a larger dining table where they could eat meals together and work on Sarah's correspondence school lessons, but the most significant addition was the wooden sign that now hung beside the front door, the Greer family carved in letters that had taken Silas 3 attempts to get right. It had replaced his old weathered nameplate, the one that had simply read S. Greer in utilitarian block letters. The new sign acknowledged what they'd all come to understand. Families weren't just created by blood or legal documents, but by choice, commitment, and love. Sarah had adapted to her new life with the same resilience that had carried her through 5 months in the wilderness. She'd grown 3 inches and gained 15 pounds of healthy weight, her face filling out and losing the sharp angles of chronic hunger. Her hair had been cut to a more manageable length, and she'd acquired a wardrobe of clothes that actually fit. But her most prized possession remained the wooden cross she'd carved during her time alone. She kept it on her bedside table, along with the toy horse that Belle had carried hidden in her collar. They were reminders not just of her survival, but of the faith that had sustained her when hope seemed impossible. Belle had settled into her role as family matriarch with regal dignity. She spent her days supervising the education of her 3 offspring. Patch had retained her alpha personality and was clearly destined to be Sarah's primary companion. Scout had developed into a reliable and gentle soul who seemed to understand that his job was to be calm and steady, while Runt had grown into his name, ironically, becoming the largest and most protective of the 3. The dogs had brought life to every corner of the cabin and surrounding property. They'd claimed various sleeping spots throughout the house. Patch usually ended up in Sarah's room. Scout preferred the main room near the fire, and Runt had established himself as Silas's shadow, following him through his daily routines with quiet devotion. Martha's memory had found its place in their new family structure. Her books were now read aloud on Sunday evenings, a tradition Sarah had started and insisted on maintaining. Her recipes had been adapted for a family of 2 + 4 dogs, creating hearty meals that filled the cabin with the kind of warmth and abundance that made a house into a home. Sarah talked easily about her parents, sharing memories that kept their love alive without dwelling on the tragedy of their loss. She'd accepted Silas's stories about Martha with the generous heart of a child who understood that love didn't diminish when it was shared, but grew stronger. On this particular morning, as Silas watched Sarah's patient attempts to explain the concept of fetch to 3 dogs who seemed more interested in playing keep away, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: absolute contentment with the present moment. Not the desperate grasping for happiness that had characterized his early marriage, or the numb resignation that had marked his years of isolation, but a quiet satisfaction with the life they'd built together. Belle approached the porch and settled beside his chair, her graying muzzle resting on his knee. At 8 years old, she was entering her senior years, but her eyes still held the intelligence and warmth that had first captured his attention in that snow-covered clearing so many months ago. "Good girl," he murmured, scratching behind her ears. "You brought us all home, didn't you?" The late afternoon sun slanted across the valley, painting the autumn aspens in shades of gold and amber. Soon the first snows would fall, sealing them into their mountain sanctuary for another winter. But this year they would face the season as a family, human and canine, chosen and cherished, bound together by the kind of love that could survive any storm. From the yard came Sarah's delighted laughter as Runt finally figured out that bringing the stick back was part of the game, followed by Patch's indignant barking as her brother stole her moment of triumph. The sounds echoed off the surrounding peaks like a promise that some stories, against all odds, really do have happy endings. Inside the cabin, the Greer family sign caught the light, its carved letters proclaiming to the world that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose, the ones you fight for, the ones you build from love and hope, and the absolute refusal to give up on the possibility of joy. And in the mountains of Montana, where winter tested everything and only the strongest survived, love had proven itself the strongest force of all.